Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very pleased to introduce Russell Knight. He's a divorce lawyer based in the US, and he has a tremendous amount of experiences that we will explore during this interview. And I'm grateful for him to come and to spend his time with me. So thank you very much for joining, Russell. How
Thank
are
you,
things
Chris.
for you?
Very good. Appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. So I just want to start with a couple of questions about a bit about your background. What kind of interested you in this field of law, and perhaps your some experiences that kind of guided your pursuit of law, specifically to
Sure.
do with that.
Yeah, sure. I started as a computer programmer out of college in 2000. And the truth is, I was not especially good at it. And so I realized I needed to make a career change. And I went to law school in 2003, 3 years after I was out of university. And then I graduated in 2006. And then 2006, I got my license right at the end of 2006, and the bottom sort of fell out of the market right before 2008. And there wasn't a lot of jobs, and so I worked for a very nice man who was in near the west side of Chicago, which is a really rough area, and he did mostly criminal work, and he paid me to drive around 5 different counties and basically get continuances for cases. And I was like, this is terrible too, but I did enjoy like the divorce work that came in. And as a lawyer, you're technically empowered to do anything. I guess is not like there's not special boards you take to do uh, contract law or personal injury. You can do anything. So what ends up happening is you do something and you get good at it, and then you get more of that work. So I like to say it's like a pie eating contest where the first prize is more pie. I then started my own firm 2 years after I was working for him. I was still very young. And then I was still doing lots of different things, but just more and more divorce came in. And I just kept leaning into it because I guess I have an aptitude for it. And also, family law is notorious for people getting into it and then finding out that they don't like it at all. And then they leave it because it's very emotional and there's lots of, it's just like an intense field. Like you're very involved in the client's worst chapter of their life. And you're not necessarily getting them to the end of the rainbow as much as you're settling, a dark chapter as best you can. So I've been doing this now for 18 years and I really enjoy it. I like being sort of a thought leader in my field. That's why I enjoy coming on and talking about it. And I also like helping people a lot. I I help people and I see them at their worst. And then when I see them on the street years later, they will literally look younger. And because I'll finally see them as they're meant to be, like a normal person where their life is settled and not in the throes of, what for some people is an existential crisis. So that's sort of how I got into it, sort of stumbling into it kind of sort of by accident. But I'm very glad that that's what the universe chose for me.
Okay, that's brilliant. Um, it's an interesting point you said just now about the fact that you're dealing with people at pretty much one of the worst times in their lives. Um, how do you cope with the challenge, the emotional and kind of the baggage and the challenge that?
Um, yeah, I would probably not be described as being super emotional. I make a great effort to be very empathetic to my clients and their issues, but I don't get personally invested in the emotional aspects. Do people call me and do they cry and do they scream? Sometimes they do all of that, but for me, it's another day at the office. And I wish them well, but they need somebody who can keep a cool head when
Yeah,
this stuff is happening. The last thing they need is for me to, put the same sort of vitriol in an email that they just put on a telephone. My job is to be a filter. I take in information and I put out better information for a third party to make determinations, whether it's the opposing counsel or a judge or whomever. So that's how I deal with it. I just sort of acknowledge that I am there to process information and not be a second source of information. I'm not going to. I don't want to throw gas on the fire, and I never have. I'm very glad that that's not really in me.
That's good. And I like what you say about, the person whose case you aided with through your services, and then a few years later you're seeing the same person, and they came through that difficult
Yeah,
experience.
always. Like there's a physical manifestation of change for sure. Because a good example is like men. When I represent a lot of men, and they will go gray, lose their hair, or gain a lot of weight during a divorce, and like it's tough. And then years later, I see them on the street. They look good because this is behind them. There's not. It's difficult having something in your life that is so big that you can't control. It really weighs on people, and so much so that it physically manifests it in the way they appear and frankly their health. So that's part of why my first advice to just about anybody is, if you're going to divorce, stop drinking and start going to the gym. Those one aggravates your problems and the other one mitigates them. That's one of the few personal pieces of advice that I end up giving my clients.
Yeah, well, that sounds that sounds very good. Um, you say that most of the clients that you help are men. Do
I
you
wouldn't
have you
say
ever had
most.
not most, but
No, maybe like 55, maybe. I'm not sure.
okay.
55% maybe. I've not done the numbers, but it's definitely closer to half than most.
Have you ever had the same client twice?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, but usually for like not for a second
Okay.
divorce. Yeah,
Okay.
but
Okay.
for like a child issue comes up that like, 5 years later or something else. But I feel like I must have, but I can't recall. I don't think so.
I was watching a podcast recently, and it was not too dissimilar to this podcast here. And divorce lawyer said that quite often the people who come through with a really difficult divorce actually end up getting married again within the next 5 years.
Oh, that's very common that they get remarried. I don't know if I get chosen for the second time to try to get divorced, but some people have a chemistry between them that it is so intense that they both aggravate each other, but they can't stay away from each other. And then it's terrible when they have a child too, because that energy ends up being overwhelming the energy that they most people really love their kids. And so the divorces are not the end of the world because most people love their kids and are willing to push past it for their kids. But it's these people who have this incredible attraction and revulsion to each other, I don't quite understand it. They can't stay away from each other and they will get back together consistently. There's some people, if you look up their names, you'll see, 2022, 2019, they'll have a case filed every other year against each other.
Wow. So my parents were together, obviously, when I was a child and a baby and a kid. They separated when I was about 8,
Yes.
and they got back together when I was like 32.
Oh, wow. Well, good for them.
They're still together now. It's not perfect, but so yeah, and obviously I'm grateful for that. But yeah, what would you say you enjoy the most about your job?
Um, I really enjoy mentoring and fostering other attorneys that work for me. I have like some very young attorneys that work for me. I have other attorneys that are not so young, but they're still developing their careers, and I'm able to make sort of a pathway to show them how to be not just be a better lawyer, but they make me a better lawyer too. What ends up happening to get to the moment of what I enjoy most is when two lawyers talk through an issue and they're both good. 1 + 1 = 3. You have one set of ideas, the other attorney has a set of ideas. You bounce off, and in the abstraction, this is pure abstraction. This is why lawyers are usually typically very bright, is because these ideas aren't something physical. They're not like, oh, like this is a cup, it's made of ceramics, it's all this. The idea of this is a set of laws, it's not something you can touch and feel. There's only, or even see, frankly, there's only one set of sense. It's like you can think about it. And so when two lawyers start talking about it and they wrestle with the issue and they're talking about basically an imaginary concept, like a negotiation, a law, the application of a law, a strategy, usually you get to a better grasp of it and a better strategy and a better idea. It's really, it's frankly brilliant. Like you talk to, it happens all the time with my staff. They're on the phone with me. We all work remotely now after post pandemic. We'll talk about an issue, and there's been many times where I'll say we can't get off the phone until we figure it out, and then 45 minutes later, I swear it gets figured out, and it's really wonderful because otherwise, if I was just on my own, I'd be like, well, I don't know, like I didn't wrestle with the issue, so I guess you're stuck with the situation you're stuck in, and like that does not happen now that I have a bunch of team members that are very bright.
That sounds amazing. What apart from mentoring them, what do you do to keep the sense of satisfaction and accomplishment on the team?
Oh, we because we're remote, there's not. I don't have a lot of expenses for rents. I have like an
Oh yeah.
office, but it's small. Um, we do a big activity every quarter. So like most people live in Chicago, so we rent out a rooftop to go to see a Cubs game. The last for our fall activity, we rented a farm and had a farm to table dinner in this really nice countryside where there's like a guy playing a guitar and everything was, grown farm to table, and had some drinks, had a good time. And then I'm bringing everybody to Naples, Florida, where my second office is for in January for the long weekend, Martin Luther King weekend. So those are the kind of things that I think I hope my staff really enjoys, and doing stuff together. And I like to do stuff that's just like a little over the top. I do not want to be like, oh, I brought pizza to the break room. No, like they make me money. I make them money. Let's spend some money on doing something really nice together.
Well, you sound like a great boss to work for.
I'm glad you think so.
That sounds amazing. So, what's one of the things you would say in terms of the day job? What's one of the things you dislike the most?
Oh, I don't mind conflict because it's a really conflict-based business. But when I'm dealing with a passionate opposing counsel that is convinced that their client and their client's cause is right, I feel like I'm banging my head against a brick wall. Like there's nothing, I'm not adding value because I can't get that person to where I need them to be. And so that type of conflict is not my favorite because it means that we'd have to go to the judge, a third party, to get something resolved. And I get it if it's their client, they're like, this is what I got to do. But when I encounter a true believer who adopts their client's position wholeheartedly, I feel like there's no synchronicity. Like there's none of that happens where the two people talk and come to a better solution. Then you have to go to a judge, and then you're talking at the judge, they're talking at the judge, and then the judge calls the balls and strikes, but the judge is not as intimately involved in the case as we are. So judges get it wrong sometimes, I think basically because of a lack of information, but it's not the judge's fault. The average lawyer is supposed to have about 30 to 40 cases. Judges have like 1,500. They can't be intimately involved in a case and know everything. So when we have to go to a judge to make a decision, invariably the judge will miss something, not through no fault of their own, just because if they can't know everything that we know, or they have to take everybody's word for it. Like that's typically what happens. So that doesn't make me super happy. I'd rather come to a solution than drag things out in court. But I do like going to trial. It's fun.
Oh, good. So I met my girlfriend when I was 21, approaching 22 in 2002.
Okay.
And she was my first girlfriend.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, the first girl who ever paid me any mind. We got engaged and married, and I've been married to her. We got married in 2004. I've been married ever since, and it's been a happy, wonderful marriage. So my experience is so I've never had a breakup. I've never had, I've never the issue of going to a divorce lawyer. For the sake of the audience, talk about the process. Like, what would be the process of a couple finding that they've decided this marriage is not working anymore. We need to you know move past it. What would then talk to what would be the process of coming to
Sure.
you? And,
So when one person thinks it's over, they inevitably talk to a divorce lawyer who prepares what's called a petition that starts the divorce. Says to the world, "Hello, world, I'm definitely getting divorced." Then that petition has to be served on the other party. Now, if the other party knows they're getting divorced, it's going to be amicable. They usually have their own lawyer, and we just send a letter saying, "Hey, do you accept service?" And they'll say, "Yeah, no problem." Otherwise, I have to hire somebody who physically gives them the papers, and is a dumb, dramatic way to start a divorce. And then they read the petition, and they're like, "Oh my God, what's happening? This is all the things they want." And then if I'm representing the person who got served, I'm like, it's just like a letter to Santa Claus. They're asking for everything. Doesn't mean they're going to get it. And then people hire their own attorneys, and then the attorneys will either prepare draft documents if the parties are approximately agreed. And you'd be shocked at how many people there's almost no fighting. Some people that have millions of dollars and massive issues, you'd think, and they're just like, "No, I'm pretty sure this is what we want to do." And then we basically turn their intentions into there's two documents. There's one called an allocation of parenting time and parent rental responsibilities, which outlines what people with children do with their child, who makes what decision. It's almost always joint if people are not don't have a personality disorder. And the parenting time, depending on where you live in Illinois, it's there's no bias towards 50-50. It's they look at whoever's the primary parent and usually try to give them more time in the best interest of the child. In Florida, where I also practice, it's definitely 50-50. It's codified, and it also becomes part of the culture that had judges tell me, unless dad or mom's an axe murderer, they're getting 50-50. So there's not that much to fight about. You wrap that up. The marital settlement agreement, conversely, is a document that governs everything financial, what all the assets that are marital and non-marital, the marital assets, how they will be divided, who's going to pay support, why that support is getting paid, and who's going to reimburse expenses for either kids or anything other ongoing concerns. And again, we prepare those hoping that we come to an agreement. And if we're not even close to an agreement, which I would guess about 50% of the time, the parties will go to mediation. In Florida, mediation is mandatory. In Illinois, it's not. And so the lawyers end up being largely mediators who shuttle back and forth between the clients to see if they can get something closer. And then in the meantime, the judges will have status dates to be like, "Are you guys any more divorced today?" And you'll say, "Well, no, because I haven't seen his bank statements from 2022. And the judge will say, "Well, did you file something asking for that?" And yeah, you say, "Yes, I did." And the judge just sort of makes sure that like the case moves forward. It's very that you almost go to court once a month on that basis in Illinois. In Florida, it's much less frequent. They rely on you to go to mediation and try to resolve those things on your own. And then they have regular case management dates where the judge checks in on a more global level. So you're kind of fighting and not fighting at the same time because you're asking for things, but you're also conceding things. Even in the most contested cases, you end up identifying what's really at issue, what's really contested. And it's usually only like 2 or 3 items. And then you can bring those 2 or 3 items to a judge on an interim basis, and the judge can make interim decisions, or you can bring those items to the judge on a final basis, which would be a trial. And then the judge decides that. I would say less than 5% of my cases end up going to trial. It's very rare and frankly, silly to have a situation be so aggravated that a trial is necessary. But sometimes it is.
Okay, and how long can it take?
That's a great question. 2 months on the lowest, and then some cases will be from like 2021, and today is 2024, and it's going to be 2025 real soon. Like under 2 years is typical, but the long ones that don't get resolved, they don't get resolved. And then judges are like, "You guys won't figure it out, so I'm just going to set this for trial." And then it gets resolved then. But often those cases, Because if you still have a child with someone, or if you have ongoing financial obligations, you're going to go back to court. Like, you're not going to, if you can't get along and work things out, then you just can't. And so they constantly need a third party to get involved. And it's sad because it's usually not both parties' fault. It's usually one party's fault. They just refuse to compromise. And so we're left with this system where we have to have a third party arbitrator, which was invariably the judge.
Okay. That's interesting. And I'm guessing the longer it goes on, the more expensive it's going to be.
Absolutely, no doubt.
Yeah. So as a relationship coach, my job is to try to help them to not come to you.
Good.
But obviously, I'm not gonna be successful at that all the time. And from your experience and your observation, what would you say couples should kind of think about in advance of the relationship?
Well, I think people get really resentful when there's a big imbalance. The best example I can give is, let's say, when women do a lot more around the house. That's been my experience. And men don't notice it. I mean, I've been married and now I'm not. And I realize all the things that my ex-wife used to do. She was a very nice lady. She's a very nice lady. I get along with her. But like, I wasn't doing much around the house. And so if you're not, a lot of men don't realize that. And then they think their contribution is like just taking out the garbage and bringing a paycheck, but the paycheck isn't even maybe the same size as the wife's, or in such excess to get like a cleaning lady or to get more help for the kids. And so I think that a lot of times when there's not an equal contribution in one person's eyes, a resentment builds, and it's really slow, and it's like a snowball. It just gets bigger and bigger. And by the time the snowball is so big, there's nothing that can be done. There's no amount of house cleaning or even financial contribution to the marriage that can undo years and years of unequal contributions. So that's what people tell me when they're saying, when they do confide in me why they got divorced. It's shockingly never, almost never infidelity. Financial infidelity is much more common, where that is a straw that breaks people's backs, where they find out, like, I can't believe it. This person got into $50,000 worth of credit card debt and didn't tell me, or this person stole all this money from our mutual account, or something like that. That is much more frequent. That is much more unforgivable in people's eyes than the traditional infidelity that we presume destroys relationships. I've found that, well, maybe people just don't tell me about that stuff because it's private and it's kind of irrelevant. So
that's interesting. Yeah, so finance is a big issue.
yeah, exactly.
In your experience, what's one of the things that you enjoy to do that helps the individual that comes in for some, to be carried through this existential crisis that their life is currently in?
Well, I like to explain to them that there is a system. The system, when you're new into it, it feels very random. It's like, wait a minute, like, how does this get decided? You're like, well, there's a bunch of laws, and like, okay. And then in Illinois, there's like 40 pages of the statute. You could read that, and it's not, some of it seems obvious, but a lot of it doesn't. And then there's a second set of laws called case law or common law, where courts wrestle with, sort of the things that happen between the rules and say, well, we say that, if someone, that property purchased after marriage is presumed marital, but like, what happens if was purchased with something that was premarital? And what happens if there was then a mortgage put on it or something like that? Those little rules, the cases wrestle with those, and they make rules that other courts are supposed to follow. And then I am kind of notorious. I write articles about these things on a constant basis. I read every case that Illinois produces, and then I write about it. And then I know all these things. So I enjoy having somebody come in my office or consult with me, and they're like, what's supposed to happen? And I can say with certainty what is supposed to happen. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, but I can say, regarding the marriage of Zito stands for the fact that just because if a house gets encumbered by a mortgage after a premarital asset, a house that was purchased before the marriage gets encumbered by a mortgage afterwards, it may make it marital property, but in reality, probably just the debt is marital and the property itself remains non-marital. And so, if somebody calls me up and it's like, oh, thank God, like, at least you know this. And I'm like, yeah, so that's, there's at least a basis. It's not just guessing, or it's not just like, well, I'll explain to the judge that you're a nice guy and they're a bad person, and that's going to resolve it. That's not what happens. There's rules. I know all the rules, and I can tell people with great certainty what I think is supposed to happen and what steps they should take to make what's supposed to happen actually happen, in a way that benefits them. So I think that's the biggest added value thing that I provide to people, to be honest.
I'm very impressed that you read all those case laws. That just gives me an idea of how vast and kind of extensive your knowledge base would be.
It takes hours. I do it every Saturday morning. It takes a minimum of 2 hours to get through just a week, because I will read cases about personal injury, because they'll have this principles that we have to apply. There's just one last week that said that there's one last week, a good example that said that, like, a judge has to weigh someone's testimony unless they're impeached, unless you can prove they're a liar. The judge has to say, well, like, they said this, so I have to, like, at least say that it came in. And like, a lot of times people bring in totally pointless witnesses, and then you're like, well, what's that for? But this judge still has to listen to them, apparently. So that was in a personal injury case. So, but that has nothing to do with a divorce per se, but it has to do with how a case is tried. So I read every single case. I then, if a new issue comes up, I'll write an article about it. I've written 720 articles. I guesstimated that if they're each 2,000 words, which is average, that it's longer than the Bible. So I started doing this, I think, like 2017, and now my brain is just full of it. And it's very satisfying to know everything about one particular subject. I'm sure a lot of people, whether they're, collecting puzzles or doing something, a lot of guys are like this. You get into one thing and then you just like, well, I kind of want to know everything about it. If you're collecting baseball cards, or and memorizing statistics, or if you're love history, or if you really enjoy what you do, and then just decide to become like a master expert in it.
Wow. That's good. Well done. I'm very impressed by you.
Thanks.
And I think it's clear that you have you're very interested in this topic, or this subject, and this role, and so it's not boring or a chore for you to explore. What's one of the things you would say to advise a young lawyer or someone who is interested in the field of law, maybe even specifically divorce law?
I would advise a young lawyer, you can't really rely on anybody else to educate you or mentor you. And then it feels like drinking out of a fire hose trying to learn it, because there's so much to know. So my advice would be to pick something extremely niche is actually how it's pronounced, something extremely niche that you're working on, and to try to do your best to learn everything about it, because it's all in books. You don't need to, there's not some secret like it's like, oh, this is how it's really done. Like, no, people write about it. It's just, there's massive amounts of case law or treaties that describe it, and you can't be expected to read it once and then say like, okay, well, now I know about this particular subject matter. What ends up happening is, if you absorb maybe 10% of it, if you read like a treatise or a book about it, and then if you read it twice, maybe you absorb the next 10%. You just keep doing that, and then you hope, you don't really have control over it. You hope you can do something called issue spotting, which is really what lawyers do. You're presented with a fact pattern, and then hopefully your brain will pop in, oh, this is like this, and that is like that, therefore you should do this. And it's really what anybody who's in knowledge work is effectively doing. And that's sort of, but you can't say this is like this or this is like that if you don't know what this or that is. So your job is to learn those things And it's mostly done by reading. You just set aside a certain amount of time a day to say, I'm going to be really good at this. I'm just going to read it. And I'm going to be kind to myself if I don't get it the first time. If I get an idea of it, that's great. And if you have to write it down, that's great. But otherwise, just keep wrestling with it, because after about a year or two, just like practicing anything else, like you're going to realize, like, I kind of know this stuff, like really. And it's not only do I know it, but like now I know how to apply it. So that's what I think a young lawyer should do, is to take complete responsibility for their capacity to know a subject matter and to just chip away at it. Just pick one thing, pick the hearsay rule. You ever seen in court where somebody goes, objection, hearsay? Well, like, what does that mean? You probably have to sit down for about 2 to 4 hours to really grasp it and all the exceptions to it. But then at least you know it. And when you're done, you're done. You just move on to the next thing. And you probably need to know about 100 things like that. And then you're a pretty competent lawyer at that point.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think what you're saying is pretty much applicable to any field.
I think you're probably right.
Yeah, just, making an effort to study and prepare yourself. That's very good, and that's why you're so good at what you do. What would you say to a relationship coach who's trying to help couples to avoid getting to that area of no return, or that point of no return in their marriage?
That's a great question. I guess I can only say to like what my level of expertise speaks to, which is what happens in a divorce. And so you could tell a relationship coach, like, if the parties are going to break up, it's not just saying, okay, we're broken up. There's consequences. Like, what's going to happen in the divorce? And then are those consequences worth the breakup? They probably still are, but without knowing the consequences of a breakup, it seems to me to be foolish for a person to call things off right away. And then the consequences are, seeing your kids half the time, paying for your own house, and probably paying for your ex's house too, dividing half of your stuff that you've saved for. The consequences are extreme. And maybe it makes it all the more important and meaningful for the breakup actually to happen, to say, like, I knew what I was getting into, I did it, therefore I've committed to the actual what I'm doing. Or it might give someone pause and be like, yes, like, I've got issues, the other person has issues, I'm willing to work on myself because the consequences feel so overwhelmingly terrible that I'm willing to give this one more shot. It makes people just more conscious either way about with either consciously trying to fix the relationship or consciously trying to abandon it.
Yeah, it does. It does sound like, yeah. Obviously, when people fall in love and they're getting married and they're making those vows, obviously, and life comes into play. And so I've got a strange, the romantic view of life, which maybe not many people or most people people have. So so when I start talking kind of philosophical in that area, maybe some of the things I say isn't general kind of agreed upon thing. But yeah, I think considering the consequences, as you've said, is should act as a positive deterrent, and hopefully not cause people to stay in an unfortunate situation, but just because the consequences are too much.
Yeah, I agree. And even if, I'd hate for someone to, like, essentially not live the life that a full life because they believe the consequences are so extreme, but they're usually not. Like, everyone survives. My clients I don't run into them. I told you earlier, I run into them in the street, they look happier. I don't run into them where they're, on the corner, homeless, or some horrible tragedies happened. People move on in life. It happens. You can look at any history thing, like a war happens or something awful, and then people pick themselves up afterwards and they just keep pushing on. All my clients have done that. I'm sure a relationships coach's clients is going to have the exact same experience.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a 86-year study from the Auburn University, and they found that the question was, what's the thing, or what are the things that lead to healthy, happy, successful lives? Healthy, happy,
I heard about this.
People. Yeah, people. And they found that good relationships, good, close, great relationship is the single most important thing, or single leading factor. They also discovered that individuals who were more or happier, they were adaptable. And sometimes people, they're approaching their worst fear thinking, my days, this thing is going to kill me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the thing happens and you're not dead. I think that people should bear in mind what you said. You do get through these difficult existential challenges. I'm a believing man, and my faith is an important part of the lens through which I see life and myself, my journey. But yeah, I think seeing past that difficult thing is an important thing to do.
I direct my clients to go to counseling all the time, whether it's a relationship counselor or like they're counseling one-on-one. Mostly like I've been in therapy, and it's what I say is like the therapist or the counselor or even a friend, it helps you think about how to think about a situation. So if you're going through a divorce, you have to say, are you going to think about this? Are you going to think about yourself as a victim of the circumstance of your ex? Are you going to think of yourself as this is a transition and that you're adapting to it? Are you going to think of yourself as the bad guy, like you did something terrible and now like you can't forgive yourself? How are you going to think about the divorce? So that's how I tell people, like, please talk to someone. And tell my personal advice that I give people is like, quit drinking, work out on a regular basis, talk to someone, and yeah, to reach out. If you're losing someone who's a partner, you're going to need more friends, frankly, or somebody else to like socialize with. A lot of times, I think a counselor is a better idea because especially men, I found that they immediately get into another relationship. It's almost identical to the one they've left. This is before they're divorced, mind you.
Okay.
And and so suddenly I've got, John and Sheila, and I'm like, who's Sheila? It's like, oh, this is my new fiance. I'm like, you're not even divorced yet, buddy. And it's like, it's great that they find each other, but I know that people need to have, contact and a relationship and someone to bounce ideas off of. And so men often will immediately get into a close relationship with another woman, I think, to substitute for the one they just left. But I think people would be better served talking to probably a counselor to determine how they should be thinking about things, because the new person, they have their own agenda and I can't blame them. They want to be with you and they want you to be divorced at any cost. And I think you person would have a better time working with someone whose agenda is completely aligned with their own, like how to come out of this better, healthier. So I think you're doing God's work and helping people think about how they should think about their situation. I think if you're helping them say, I'm empowered by this. It's bad. Yes. I'm bigger than the situation. I'm going to be okay. My kids are going to be okay. Even my ex is going to be okay. This is something that had to happen. And even if it didn't, I'm going to get through it. I'm going to make myself as good as possible considering the circumstances. Because we all have these tapes to play in our head, and you can either play that tape that I just described, or you can play some horrible tape where you're awful, your ex is awful, what's going to happen, I feel awful. And that's no way to live.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. So my role as a relationship coach is, and one thing I was going to say offhand, I was just thinking about this actually when you were saying, is loneliness has become a really big issue. And if a man who is kind of transitioning from this marriage that didn't work and then launching himself straight into another long-term relationship, there might be, and so I'm not a psychologist, like I'm not a psychotherapist, so I don't deal with issues around mental health and things. I'm a I'm a organizational psychologist and an interpersonal coach. So I'm dealing with the relationship between two individuals, like between the husband and the wife, and so issues around levels of loneliness or people's background, maybe their attachment styles, what drove them into not having the successful relationship in the first place, and what may cause them to launch from one relationship, one marriage to another. One thing I was gonna say is, your Surgeon General,
Yeah.
he's recently spoken about this pandemic of loneliness and how much of a big problem it is. Obviously, that usually when there's some social issues in America, it's
Mhm.
not too far from what we're experiencing over here in the UK.
Yeah.
Do you see that as being an issue?
Yeah. Well, like the pandemic, I did the math for it to see if there was more, if there were more divorces, because the common wisdom was that, like people are stuck inside the same house, so they're yelling at each other or fighting. There was no more divorces filed during the pandemic than before or after. It wasn't appreciably different. What ended up happening, in my estimation, because I couldn't track this, is that the divorces got a lot longer. I don't know if that has to do with loneliness, but I'm not so sure that there is a crisis of loneliness and if it was caused by the pandemic, is maybe just more atomization of people as the world becomes more modern. We don't have big extended families anymore that we see all the time. A lot of us don't go to church, or people aren't even in a bowling league anymore where they see people on a regular basis. I think, like I said before, like that's one of the healthier things anyone can do. Is we all want deep, meaningful relationships. That's why people get in relationships in the first place. And maybe the answer to your current relationship is to have an outlet in another relationship. So you're not looking to your one relationship to fill some emotional need that maybe a friend or a family member or somebody else on your bowling team, for example, could fill that. I'm not so sure that if there's a loneliness crisis, it has more to do with the way our society both encourages and allows us to be alone. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you. So as a part of I've got a coaching program.
Mm-hmm.
It's an 8-week program, and it takes couples through whatever difficulties or challenges that they're experiencing, and helps them to kind of create agreements with each other. So move away from expectations of each other and actually make these agreements as explicit and as clear and as outlined as possible, and then bind each other to keeping those agreements that they've made, so that they can, be more aligned, be on the same page. Do you find that sometimes the couples, they might have one expectation, like one member of the relationship might have an expectation, the other one might have another completely different? They're just going in their mind.
Yeah, you're probably totally right.
Huh?
You're probably 100% right that the people aren't simply communicating what their expectations are, and therefore a resentment sets in, and resentment is the road to divorce, period. So I think even communicating, I need this in my life, or I need that, it sounds like it's selfish, but the reality is if you communicate to the other party that this is something you need, you're really doing that for the benefit of the relationship, not for just your own benefit, and also making it safe for the other person to say, hey, this is what I need. Or it's immature to presume that you're going to assume what all the other person's needs are without effectively communicating between them. But like, that's the position people get into, and I think it's fantastic what you're doing. I think more relationships would be, most people like, are these divorces even necessary? Like, sometimes, yes, people outgrow each other, but I'm at the end of the giant snowball of resentment that came down the mountain over years and years. If somebody had just stopped the snowball earlier, maybe I wouldn't be there dealing with these issues. So don't worry, there's plenty of work for me to go around. So it's not.
Yeah. I was gonna say, yeah,
okay. Right. If you save 100 to 2 or 1,000 relationships in your career, it won't affect me at all.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our talk. Let me tell you about my background. So in my master's degree, it was an organizational psychology degree. So it was to do with work. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really impressed with you as a boss. So you really engage the staff. And so thumbs up on that one. The focus I was looking at is the psychological contract.
Yeah.
And the psychological contract is that contract you have in your mind, or the expectations, should I say, you have of the organization or the boss. And if those expectations aren't met, you experience a psychological contract breach. Now, the problem with that is the other person does not know. The other person doesn't have the ability to read your mind. They don't know what's on your mind. They don't know what the psychological contracts you have. There might be some mutual expectations, and that does work sometimes. But for the most part, people don't know exactly what the other person's thinking. And so my research was trying to find a solution, was solutions focused. And I came up with this process called the covenantal process, which is a 7-step process that takes people from their expectations to actually sitting down and making actual agreements with each other. So the move from the psychological contract to the covenant making is kind of my niche, and that's my main focus, and that's how I kind of help couples to bridge the gap between their expectations and their agreements with each other.
Well, I think this idea of like making a contract, whether it's like, is not strange to me. It's that we do it all the time. We have people that are married, and they will say, I need to have a postnuptial agreement. I need to know what's going to happen if we split up, and you can put conditions in it. Some people I've never written one, but I've read them, where someone will be like a serial cheater, and they will put it in there. Like, if you cheat, and goes, you get nothing. Or there'll be things that we put in saying this is what happens in a divorce. And so maybe what you're doing is a little bit of a sort of a postnuptial agreement in some ways, or at least it's leading up to it. So maybe that's a better way to think, like, this is the first step before a postnup, because this is the idea of a postnup, is to keep the people together under new understandings of what would happen if they got divorced. Otherwise, they just get divorced, right? And so to me, as a divorce lawyer, what I'm hearing is, no, I can do even deeper than that. We can do an agreement that is both deeper and more meaningful and touches on all these things but it doesn't have to have some negative consequence like a postnup.
Yeah. Thank you I think that's a really good way to conceptualize it.
Yeah.
So the process, this covenantal process, is a 7-step process. So the process starts with an initiation, which is where the couples, they decide they are interested in making this marriage work, and so they're initiating the process. And then there is an investigation, which is where they sit down individually and they explore, what are my expectations of my spouse and what can I do to fulfill their expectations. These are, in terms of their spouse's expectations, these are assumptions. Then the third step is the sit down, and they sit down and they start to agree upon some, start to make some agreements with each other. And they could come out of the meeting with 10, 15 covenants. And
Mhm.
then they use these to, the next two steps are the negotiation, where they decide how to make them as mutually beneficial as possible, and the closing the deal, when they kind of go over the whole thing again. And then step number 6 is the promise, and then step number 7 is the sealing, where they sign it off.
Well, I
So
love that. I love how technical it is. This is up my alley.
yeah, yeah. So the idea is to take them through a process that helps them to make these agreements with each other and try to live up to them, and try to, sometimes in a relationship you may have one member of the relationship who's a bit more dominant and takes the lead. This covenantal process is supposed to help them to neutralize that power imbalance, and to help them to create some strong boundaries and some strong agreements that work for both of them. So I just want to say a very big thank you for taking the time to meet with me, and for sharing your expertise. I think there's a lot that we've learned from you and from your experience, and I look forward to collaborating in the future, and just to see how things are with you. So thank you. Have a wonderful day, and thanks again.
Thank you. Take care. Bye bye.